Welcome back. Here with us on Urban Debate on Mirror Now. Prime Minister Narendra Modi is in Japan to attend the crucial summit of Quad leaders tomorrow. The meeting is aimed at bolstering cooperation among member nations and discuss developments in the strategic Indo-Pacific region. Prime Minister had a power-packed day. He met members of Indian diaspora in Tokyo today. He held a roundtable with some of the top business leaders in Japan. He was also part of the launch of Indo-Pacific Trade Pact, something that India has joined. It's a US-led Indo-Pacific Economic Framework that India has also joined. And live from Tokyo this evening for us is my colleague Madhav, who's been bringing to us minute-by-minute updates of this very, very crucial visit of Prime Minister Narendra Modi. Madhav, good evening. It's been a long day for you. Working non-stop for over 23 hours now. Did you get something to eat or not first? Tell our viewers.
Oh, well, thanks so much for that, Heena. Yes, that's pretty much part of the job when one is traveling internationally and when one is covering, the schedule of Prime Minister Modi, which is as hectic as it can possibly get. And yes, finally, we did get to sample some Japanese food. But as you said, from this morning, right from the welcoming by the Indian community here, where the Prime Minister interacted with a number of children, to the end of the day, which also incidentally ended with the Prime Minister interacting with the Indian diaspora here in Tokyo. In fact, people from as far as about 700-800 kilometers flew in to Tokyo just to hear the Prime Minister speak, and they were completely inspired by the kind of words that the Prime Minister used. But yes, it's been a very hectic day. He's hit the ground running. While the Quad is, of course, an important part of it, today's meeting of India really being part of the Indo-Pacific Regional Economic Partnership is also being seen as a very, very important step, because even before the announcement could be made, we saw the sharp rhetoric coming in from the side of China, which said that it would not be a successful positioning. And in fact, over 12 plus countries that now, after India has joined this grouping, is of course a very, very significant move, because it's been also seen as some kind of a response to China's own Belt and Road initiative. But be that as it may, another important meeting the Prime Minister had was with CEOs of several top corporations of Japan. Now, several of these companies are already present in India. Several of them are wanting to expand their small footprint in India as well. And that certainly is very important from the perspective of investment. Several of them seeing India as also a big IT superpower and therefore wanting to tap into that potential as well. So all in all, a very hectic first day. Tomorrow, of course, we'll be looking at the Prime Minister attending the Quad meeting. And then, of course, there are the all-important bilateral meetings with not just the Prime Minister of Japan, but also the newly elected Australian Prime Minister, Anthony Albanese. Of course, the Prime Minister had a very good relationship with his predecessor, Scott Morrison. So tomorrow will be key in establishing how the tone of the relationship between the two leaders of India and Australia is established. And the all-important meeting, of course, will be that with US President Joe Biden, because Joe Biden has in the past had a very, very different stand. The US has a very different stand from the stand that India has taken, particularly when it comes to the Ukraine-Russia war. While India has, of course, maintained a balanced stand, which has worked to Russia's favor in many forums, international forums such as the UNSC, and America has always tried to establish pressure on India to change its position, because it is vehemently opposed to the position and the war that Russia has at some level or the other been seen as responsible for in Ukraine. Clearly, India has managed to ward off all that pressure and continue with its policy of non-alignment, not being aligned with any one particular side. So we'll have to see how all of that plays out on ground tomorrow during the course of that bilateral meeting as well as the Quad meeting.
Well, that's right. We'll, of course, keep an eye on the bilaterals and Quad summit tomorrow. Madhav, appreciate you joining us and bringing us up to speed with the developments of the day and what viewers should watch out for now tomorrow as far as Prime Minister's visit to Japan is concerned. Madhav there reporting live from Tokyo for Mirror Now this evening. Thank you, Madhav, for the moment for joining us with all of those details. Now, as Madhav told us about that crucial Indo-Pacific trade or economic framework that was in fact led by US President Joe Biden. What is it? Is it just like any other trade agreement that countries sign, or there's something that India can really look forward to as far as this particular trade agreement is concerned? So let's try and decode this with our guest joining us on the broadcast this evening, Dr. Jagannath Panda, head Stockholm Center for South Asian and Indo-Pacific Affairs, live with us. We are also joined by Maroof Raza, consulting editor, Times Network, and Meera Shankar, former ambassador, is also going to be joining us in just a bit. Good evening to all of you. Thank you for joining us here on Urban Debate on Mirror Now. Dr. Panda, I want to begin the discussion with you. India has joined this US-led Indo-Pacific Economic Framework. In a nutshell, could you simplify it for us, for our viewers? What is it? Is it aimed at countering Dragon?
Two things. One is this is an extended format of China Plus framework. For a long time, I think after the pandemic, we are talking about extending the businesses beyond China. So I think this Indo-Pacific framework is a part and parcel of that process. Second, I think this Indo-Pacific economic framework is a part of the supply chain resilience initiative that India, Japan, and Australia are talking about, who are actually close strategic partner of the US. So in a way, this is a welcome news for India because signing and being a part of these economic frameworks only complements India's Indo-Pacific game plan. So to that extent, this is a very welcome addition and it strengthens the Indo-Pacific coalition as far as the economic configuration is concerned. But again, just being a part of this framework does not really help India. India needs to really put its own house in order as far as the competitiveness of the market is concerned in the Indo-Pacific. And we know for a fact that India is not a part of the RCEP mechanism, Regional Comprehensive Economic Partnership mechanism. India is not a part of CPTPP. So therefore, a lot has to be discussed before India commits and be an integral part of this process.
Okay. Maroof, what's your understanding of this Indo-Pacific Economic Framework? Taiwan is not a part of it, and I was looking at some data which suggested that if Taiwan is a major, leading manufacturer of computer chips, and then this kind of a partnership and the agenda that US and other countries would have from this kind of a framework might not get fulfilled. Could you unmute yourself?
That's a very good question, and I've been trying to answer that myself, that why is Taiwan not part of the Indo-Pacific Economic Forum or this initiative? Well, I think the US is still very wary of upsetting the Chinese, but they don't realize that when you scale up events of this nature with heads of states meeting for dominance in a region where the Chinese had been looking at as their backyard for many years, you're obviously going to upset the Chinese. The second thing is, Taiwan is a very big economic player in the Indo-Pacific and in East Asia, Asia, and maybe globally also. You brought out, there's a company in China called TSMC, which is the world's top-notch semiconductors manufacturer. And as you know, semiconductors are really the core of most of the technologies that the world is been wanting to get into their grips to be the next step ahead of their rivals economically. The third aspect is that if you're not against China, then why all this messaging about free movement in the high seas, which is an indirect slant at China for dominating for years the Asia-Pacific waterways, particularly in the South China Sea? If you're not against China, then what are you ganging up so urgently for? And if you're not against Russia, then why is Russia, Ukraine on the agenda? I know most of the countries are on America's side because of America's huge control of the dollar-related global market. But the bottom line is, what is India in it for? And please understand, historically, countries have come together for two reasons. One is the possibility of enhancing their economic growth with trade, as we are seeing with the Indo-Pacific initiatives. And two, the fear of an invasion, which is what Europe has now suddenly got more energized with the Russian invasion of Ukraine. And in both cases, this logic even applies to India. We are the only Asia Pacific or Indo-Pacific country which is a primary element of the the Quad grouping, which has a border problem with China, and we have Chinese troops staring down at us in Ladakh, as we know only too well. There are about 12 countries that are part of this initiative. So therefore, there are many, which I've been saying for years, which are part of the Quad Plus, which want to get into the Quad. So there needs to be a very clear messaging that needs to go out. Nothing works better to avert conflict and muscle flexing by a neighbor like China than to give a very clear message. The Asia Pacific grouping of Quad is not giving that very clear anti-China message, but China has not stopped in pointing fingers at this group as saying it's an initiative that won't work. It's an initiative which is anti-China. At the earliest stages, they'd called it the Asian NATO. So really, I think my central problem with the Quad initiative as it stands, that if it's just a business grouping, then you are an Asian G7 or whatever, G12. But if it is a strategic grouping, then you have to give it a military dimension to it, which is more specifically a maritime military dimension, to tell China that don't you dare encroach on any of the countries that are part of this group. It's the kind of messaging that America has not been shy to give from NATO to Russia. So are we waiting for a Chinese invasion to get into that same messaging after the invasion takes place? Because nothing works well if deterrence is in place. And if deterrence and messaging is not in place, then Russia will do what it did, and China will do in Taiwan what it plans to do. Back to you.
Okay. Interesting. Meera Shankar, is it just like another RCEP that India could not join, that India did not join actually, or a replacement of something like a Trans-Pacific partnership that US could not go back into because Biden's predecessor pulled US out of it? What is exactly this Indo-Pacific Economic Framework, and what is it that India seeks to achieve?
Well, I think we are all trying to figure out what it is, but I think it's a question of how the US can give some economic content to its partnerships in the this Indo-Pacific region in the face of strong protectionist sentiment in their polity and society. If you go back, you'd see it was the Democratic Party under President Obama who negotiated the Trans-Pacific Agreement. And this was an essential part of the US strategy to pivot towards what was then called the Asia Pacific. This was the economic component, and it carried a great deal of heft because the economic relationship with the US is a core factor in the relations that most of the countries in this region have with America. But then when President Trump came, he walked out of it. And since then, actually, sentiment in the US has been such that, the talk of any free trade agreement has not really been welcome at all. So in the face of those political restrictions, or what could I say, constraints, not restrictions, I should say constraints, the Biden administration is trying to give some economic dimension to their engagement in the region, but they are not going to touch the area of tariffs. They are not going to touch the area of market access. So the areas they will focus on are very much playing to the US strength in terms of critical supply chains. That's important because, we've seen during the pandemic that there's been, a constriction of supply of many commodities, and certainly sometimes even very critical commodities or goods. And so how do you de-risk and not have everything concentrated in one country. I think that's very much a part of the strategy of the Quad also. The second is, critical technologies themselves and digital trade, because this is an area where there's strong competition now between the US and China. And we're probably going to see the emergence of alternative systems or networks. Do countries join 5G using US and Western technology, or do they adopt Chinese technology for it? And whichever choice they make will, in a sense, determine which networks of the future they are going to be a part of. So I think that would be one of the issues on the table. The other is infrastructure and, of course, clean technologies. Again, looking very much at climate change and what could be done to facilitate an energy transition, accelerate use of green hydrogen, create green shipping corridor to the Indo-Pacific. I think these are some of the suggestions. And I would say that there is an overlap between many of these areas and the areas that the Quad has agreed to focus on. Now, for India, this is still an opportunity, because as companies seek to de-risk, then they are going to be looking at moving supply chains out of China, where they have been concentrated, in overwhelming numbers. So this is an opportunity for India. Of course, much of the movement has been towards Vietnam, which has been the main beneficiary of this. But some have come to India, such as, Apple, which is being made here, or Foxconn, which has set up an assembly unit here. So this is something which we would like to encourage. And therefore, being part of it would be of interest to us. But we have also kept our options open, in the sense that we will participate in the negotiations and see where it goes. And then, depending on how things pan out, take a view. But Prime Minister Modi has emphasized that it should be inclusive and it should be flexible. These are the 2 points he has emphasized for the framework. At the moment, a very somewhat nebulous
2
concept.
points he has used in. Yes. Okay. 2 words are very, very crucial: inclusive and flexible, as you said, which Prime Minister Modi used for this particular framework. Dr. Jagannath Panda, so if it is going to be some sort of an economic arrangement, are we then given to understand, if tomorrow in future ever there is a situation which we faced, which a country like India and many other countries in the world faced, of shortage of semiconductor chips because of the supply issues, supply disruption that happened because we were all heavily dependent upon China, would that not happen under this particular framework if all these countries are together? Is that the idea?
I think it will be very difficult to find a solution to the semiconductor problem at this moment. Taiwan is not a part of this Indo-Pacific economic framework. And we know for a fact that Taiwan is known for the semiconductor industry. Of course, South Korea is there. South Korea is one of those critical economy where we could rely on the semiconductor supply, new supply chain, factoring the semiconductor. But again, I think semiconductor is a very complex issue. It needs infrastructural facility. It needs a concentrated supply chain networks, which will be, fairer, resilient, and a much more safer environment of business cooperation. And I think unless issues like semiconductor discussed in details and a map is prepared on how to go about this business construction, it is very difficult at this moment to talk about a semiconductor supply chain like business under this economic framework, since Taiwan is not a part of this process. And I think one of the panelists, Mr. Maroof Raza, rightly pointed out, I think if we really need to have a Taiwan into this framework, then probably it will be very forthcoming to think areas like semiconductor will be taken care of. But I think there are many gray areas, And economic scenarios, economic complexities are very complex games. No countries are going to make easy concession to others. And therefore, we need a much more consensus building approach when it comes to issues like semiconductor.
Okay, Maroof Raza, now also all eyes are going to be on the bilateral with US President Joe Biden and the Quad Summit. Do you think once again US President might try and nudge India about how India is looking at the Russia-Ukraine crisis? Because even though we're not talking about it that much, but that crisis is still going on. Do you think there can be discussion around that too?
Yes, absolutely. But before I come to that, I just want to build up on a slight point that Dr. Jagannath had spoken about and Ambassador Meera Shankar had also referred to. You see, a comprehensive economic arrangement between all these countries is something which might not be easy to put together, except for some bilateral arrangements, because all the countries, the key players in Quad, have bilateral arrangements between them. The US and Australia, the US and Japan, India-US strategic partnerships. And so therefore, I don't know what more that we want to achieve with this arrangement, except that there will be smooth flow of a lot of technologies, from vaccines to supply chain related items and also semiconductors. But as Dr. Jagannath said, I mean, how can you do a talk about energy issues without Saudi Arabia being present there? I'm just giving you an analogy. Now, when we get into the Ukraine issue, quite clearly, the Ukraine conflict has been the turnaround moment for Mr. Biden's administration after their humiliating withdrawal from Afghanistan. And it has given them a chance to find their sweet spot in geopolitics, where they've become the leader of the European world again, and not allowed Europe to become a counterforce to the Americans, but become part of the American umbrella in geostrategy. And therefore, to get also India on board is something that the Biden administration is very keen on. We've had direct, indirect messaging coming in, but quite clearly, India is very clear about its positions. And I think what's going to come out of this conference is that India will firm up its position as a swing state. A swing state is one that has a position and standing of its own and is able to respond to a situation from time to time, depending on its own geostrategic interests. And that is something that will become more and more apparent as we go along with this. Yes, Ukraine, Russia is something that Mr. Biden is going to keep pushing hard for, because they have managed to stall Russia's invasion, but they've also managed to show that Russia and its military power has its limits. But if they keep pushing and try and get Russia to totally crumble against the baggage of this invasion, then I think we are asking for the conflict to get out of control in another direction, because, you know, a superpower doesn't go away overnight.
Absolutely. Already we know the kind of statements that are coming from China. That's like that's also being seen as a threat. In fact, China has said that this is some sort of an exclusive clique that would lead to greater turmoil actually in the region. I want to give you the last word, Ms. Meera Shankar. This is the fifth visit of Prime Minister Narendra Modi to Japan in the last 8 years. What is it that we can expect in terms of how it will have an impact on Indians here? Because we know how Japan has always invested a lot in Indian infrastructure.
Well, I think Japan has been one of our, in fact, the largest bilateral aid giver to India, and has been a key player in our infrastructure sector based on the aid that they have given us, whether it is the metro, whether it is fast trains. I think this is something which Japan is good at. But I do feel that Japanese investment in India has been somewhat hesitant. If you look at the quantum of Japanese investment in China, even today, it is absolutely huge and of a great, of a different order of magnitude than what they have in India, where it is still somewhat hesitant. So I think that needs to change. and the last visit of Prime Minister Kishida to India, where they had agreed on a target of 5 trillion yen investment by Japan, which is something like $40 billion investment over the next next several years. I think that's a good target that they have set themselves.
Right.
So that is important. Now, in terms of India's own strategy in this region, one is, given the asymmetries between India and China, which are increasing both militarily and economically and technologically,
Right.
then India needs to get an external balancer in the region, which would help to ensure that, China's effort to dominate the region is balanced, even if
Right.
there may not be direct intervention. So that is one. But in addition to that, we seek to build coalitions with regional partners who are there to stay in the region
Yes.
and who have similar concerns about
Yes.
China. Now, whether it is Japan, which has a dispute with China in the East China Sea, whether it is Chinese aggressive behavior in
Right.
the South China Sea, whether it is the pressure that they have been putting on Australia on account of trade, because
Yes.
of Australia's demand for an inquiry into the origin of the pandemic. I think these
Yes.
are all issues.
I think the point, ma'am, that you've
of
raised about
concern.
external balancer is very, very interesting. Yes, I'm completely out of time, ma'am, but I'd like to thank all of you. Thank you very much for joining us here on Urban Debate on Mirror Now this evening. We'll, of course, be tracking this closely ahead as well. Thank you for the moment for staying with us on Urban Debate. Heading into a short break. Reha joins you next. Don't go anywhere.